Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm resident scholar here at AEI and director of the program on American citizenship. Today's event, as you know, is centered on the question of the Senate filibuster, a long-standing privilege by which senator or senators can prevent a vote on a number of measures, not all, unless, of course, a majority, in this case, a supermajority of 60 senators vote to end it. Now, frustrated by the lack of movement on various measures, President Trump has called the filibuster archaic, and just this morning, in his indomitable, erudite way, called it horrible. As the president has said, I get things done. I've always been a closer. And to his mind, this is a rule that stands in the way of getting things done. Although a member of the president's party and also willing to make an exception when it comes to the confirmation process for the Supreme Court justices, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been quite clear that he has no intention of expanding that exception. According to the senator, quote, it would fundamentally change the way the Senate has worked for a very long time. We're not going to do that, end quote. Now, the filibuster rule is nowhere to be found in the text of the Constitution, but it is a privilege of long standing, so much so that many see it as a rule that follows quite logically from the need to assist the Senate in its proper constitutional functioning. But of course, times and circumstances change. It's a rule that was put in place more than a century before ratification of the 17th Amendment, which provided for the direct popular election of senators. Perhaps what made sense then no longer makes sense, perhaps. Of course, the key issue is whether the filibuster makes the Senate a better legislative body. And while that question is easy to ask, it's not so easy to answer, since being a legislative body entails diverse tasks. It involves deliberation, appropriating monies, conducting oversight, and passing legislation, and doing so while representing their constituencies. Now, joining me today to discuss these questions are Sai Prakash, James Wallner, and Peter Hansen. You have your bios, and they're online as well, so let me just introduce them briefly and in the order that they will speak. To my right is Sai Prakash, who's the James Monroe Professor of Law at the University of Virginia Law School. Widely published, he teaches constitutional law and foreign relations law at Virginia. He is clerked for federal appellate judge Larry Silberman and Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And he's author of a very fine volume on the origins and the original design of the American presidency. James Wallner is a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, where he focuses on topics and issues related to Congress and the federal policy process. A former senior Senate staffer, James has authored 2 books dealing with the issue of partisanship, polarization, and the procedural changes of recent years within the Senate. Peter Hansen has also worked in Congress as a senior aide within the Senate legislative team, has published widely, and is the author of a book on the appropriation process in the U.S. Senate and the decline of the majority's power in that body. He now teaches political science at Bucolic Grinnell College in Iowa. So again, our speakers will go about eight or so minutes. We'll probably have some back and forth between the panelists, but also then we'll invite your questions from the audience. And again, thank you for being here and for those online watching. So, Sai.
Thanks so much, Gary, for inviting me to speak today. I think the answer to all our questions can be found in a book of Gary's published by Brookings this year. The book is entitled Is Congress Broken? I won't spoil the ending for you. I'm particularly honored to be with these 2 fine gentlemen. They know far more about this than I, having served in the Senate, not as senators, but as aides to senators. I'm just a dabbler here. George Washington supposedly compared the House to a hot drink and the Senate to a saucer. We pour the hot drink into the saucer to cool it, said Washington, or he allegedly said to Jefferson. Likewise, the Senate serves as a check on the House and its popular passions. A drink that is initially too hot to consume gradually reaches the right temperature. So that's the role that Washington thought of when he thought of the Senate. The Senate filibuster is one of the principal means by which the Senate cools proposals of all sorts, including ones from the House. I, for one, think there is too much cooling going on. The emergence of the two-track filibuster in the 1970s has encouraged the use of a cheap parliamentary tactic that has weakened the Senate and thereby weakened Congress, in my view. I favor a stronger Congress, and hence I favor elimination of a device that has weakened it. In this talk, I'll speak to the arguments that I think are typically brought forward to defend the filibuster and argue that they don't hold much water, and then I'll pivot to the drawbacks that I perceive in the persistence of the filibuster and other tactics in the Senate. So I think the filibuster is typically defended on three grounds. Each, in my view, is shaky. So first is the claim that the filibuster encourages deliberation. The filibuster allows senators and the country to more closely focus on a particular issue, be it civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, drone strikes during the Obama administration, or the merits of the National Recovery Administration during the Roosevelt administration. Second, the filibuster is said to allow the minority to signal how intensely it despises some measure or nominee. Right? The filibuster allows the minority to prevail by not allowing a vote on the matter in question, and presumably the minority will only resort to the filibuster if they feel really passionately about something. And third, the filibuster is said to protect minority rights, because again, if you can't get a supermajority to end debate, the minority doesn't lose on the matter. Let me take up these three arguments in turn. As to deliberation, I think the filibuster is neither necessary nor sufficient for deliberation. In the age of the internet, we can get plenty of deliberating outside the halls of the outside the Senate. There's more debate going on outside the Senate than inside it. In years past, maybe it was only possible for senators to converse by speechifying in the Senate, but I think that's no longer true. Right? We can deliberate outside the chambers. We don't need to have interminable debate within it. And I think this is just true for most speeches these days, right? The State of the Union is a boring speech. Oral arguments for the Supreme Court are only interesting to the people in the audience. They generally don't decide the case. And I think that's just true for most speeches in the Senate. I can't remember a memorable speech in the Senate. Right? When I think of the famous speeches of the Senate, I think of the Haynes-Webster debate from the 19th century. There's nothing like that today going on in the Senate. So it seems to me the argument for deliberation is overemphasized. And I think it's especially true today, right? Because the modern filibuster doesn't actually promote debate. It just shuts down debate. There's often no, bills aren't taken up anymore because there's a threat of a filibuster, because the majority doesn't want to bother trying to break it. And then the final thing I add is that even under the old set of rules where they actually had to filibuster, where senators had to get up and read from the phone book, the debate wasn't edifying because they were reading from the phone book, right? And so why someone droning on and on about pot liquor recipes or the phone book, or in some cases reading from the Bible, a book that many people had already read, why that would be edifying and why that would further deliberation is a bit of a mystery to me. So I just don't think that the filibuster ever served this role. I think a rule designed to give senators ample time to debate would foster deliberation in the Senate perhaps, but not the filibuster. As to the intensity of preferences, I think it's true that when senators filibuster, when they actually filibuster, they're signaling how much they oppose some measure. But I think there are other ways of signaling intensity of preferences that don't involve the filibuster, which is one way is just to go to your colleagues and tell them, this is of only marginal interest to you. It really matters to me. Please consider my views, the intensity with which I'm expressing them to you, in deciding how to vote. And I think if you're some senator that only does that occasionally, you will be taken seriously. If, on the other hand, you claim that every single time you're in the minority you feel very intensely about it, you won't be taken seriously. But there's just other ways to signal intensity of preferences without bottling up the Senate. And then with respect to minority rights, again, I will concede that the filibuster does in some way protect minority rights, but we have a system that already does that. We have bicameralism, right? You have to pass both chambers before you have a bill that can be presented to the president, and of course it has to go to the president. So the system of bicameralism that Article 1, Section 7 establishes, I think already goes a long way to protecting minority rights. Another way of making the point is that a minority coalition loses only if it is a minority in all three institutions, the House, Senate, and the president. But I'd go beyond that, because we also have a fourth branch of government, the deep state, the bureaucracy, and they can also be a way for the minority in the Senate, or the minority in the House for that matter, to get its way. Right? When the bureaucracy gets hold of a proposal, it can do wondrous things to it, including interpret it and enforce it in ways that the Congress would not have suspected was possible. I'm not endorsing this practice, but it's a fact that this happens in Washington, that statutes are read in ways that the Congress that enacted them would have been surprised by. And then I'll add a fifth layer of protection for minorities, and that's the courts. Right? The courts also are able to twist and turn statutes in ways that the majority in Congress might not have preferred. And so the minority has many different bites at the apple. It has the House, the minority in the Senate has the House, it has the presidency, it of course has the Senate itself, it has the bureaucracy, and it has the courts. And so I think it's true that the filibuster protects the minority in the Senate in a way, but I wonder whether it's necessary in the context of the other protections that the minority in the Senate has, both in the Senate and outside the Senate. I mean, so if going back to Washington's simile, we've got a cup, we've got a saucer, we've got a bib, we've got heat-resistant gloves, and each of this is protecting us from the hot drinks. Do we need the filibuster on top of that? Let me shift gears and talk for a moment about what I perceive to be the consequences of gridlock in the Senate and gridlock in the House. Napoleon once supposedly said, "The tools belong to the man that will use them," or as someone else put it, "Politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum." When Congress grinds to a halt, passing little more than National Garbage Can Day resolutions, other Washingtonian institutions gain clout. I've already mentioned the vast federal bureaucracy. They gain when Congress doesn't pass legislation because they see it as, I think, a partial license to re-understand existing statutes. The president also gains, and so do the courts. So it's if the Congress is unable to get its act together, the other institutions in Washington gain, and that's not obviously a good thing to me. I think the founders understood the Congress to be the preeminent branch, and it's having a difficult time doing so when rules in the Senate enable a minority to bottle up Senate business. And I'll stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for questions.
Peter, why don't you go ahead? Then. Sure.
Well, Gary, thanks for this invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As you said, I come from the bucolic cornfields of Iowa, so it's nice to be back in Washington. I want to start out on a little bit of a different note and maybe argue against some of the conventional wisdom about Congress these days. I think it's very common and perhaps even fashionable to say that Congress is broken. It's not working anymore, it's not deliberating anymore, and that it needs fixing. And I would simply make a couple of points about that. The first is broken compared to what? Compared to an ideal Congress that existed at some point in the past that functioned perfectly. I think we need to be really concrete about what we're comparing it to. The job of Congress is to peaceably sort out matters that deeply divide the country, and the country is divided. And so it's no surprise in that sense that Congress has a difficult time legislating over matters that are politically divisive. So this is an inherently challenging task, and I think we need to bear that in mind. I think also there's a sort of tacit comparison that is always made when talking about Congress today, and it's to the Congress of the 1960s, the so-called textbook Congress, which I think is held up as the way Congress should function. Of course, if you would back up 50 years from that period, we'd be in a period of intense polarization just like today when Congress faced many of the same kind of challenges we see today. But even compared to the textbook Congress, I question whether we would really want to go back there. That was a time when there was a great deal of bipartisanship, but that bipartisanship rested on a Democratic Party that was divided between Northern liberals and Southern segregationists. Committees were controlled by Southern chairs, often deeply conservative, who were aimed at protecting the Southern system. That's not a system I particularly want to go back to. And so I think we are in some peril when we hold that up as something we want to emulate. Bills also had a hard time coming to the floor then, often because they were bottled up in committee. And debate was often constrained by powerful norms in the Senate, in which individual rank and file members were reluctant to defy powerful chairs. So I think we need to keep today's problems in some context and just recognize that there is no time, no perfect time in Congress that we can return to. In fact, if we would go back to the 1950s, you would see the American Political Science Association criticizing Congress, saying parties stood for nothing, that they needed to strengthen and start to fight for bills, calling for really what we see today, a much stronger parties, much more partisan Congress. So I'm always cognizant of the perils of calling for reform. I think the second question I'd like to ask about the filibuster is, what precisely is the problem? Is it our procedures or our politics? My colleagues in political science, Francis Lee and Jim Curry, recently wrote a paper pointing out that Congress routinely does pass legislation on major issues, and in fact amasses bipartisan coalitions to do that. If you look at the previous Congress, that included a major transportation bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the doctor's fix for Medicare. Now, those aren't particularly sexy topics to a lot of people. They don't end up in the headlines, and I think oftentimes we only think about Congress being gridlocked on those issues that most deeply divide us, as opposed to the ones that it regularly does act upon. But I think there's no question that matters are being left on the table. The filibustering is being used much more often than it was used in the past. Congress is clearly gridlocked on some issues. They're unable to address important issues. But is that the fault of procedure, or is that the fault of our politics? I work with a lot of budget experts who are convinced that if we tinker with the system enough, we will miraculously pass a balanced budget. Well, it's not the procedures that are the problem. It's the fact that we disagree on taxes and spending. The actual policy problem is not that hard to solve. I think it's the fact that our parties, backed by an array of interest groups, disagree on how to do that. Additionally, we can look at examples such as the consideration of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in Congress and see that the filibuster, again, is not the source of the Republicans' inability to pass that legislation. It's the fact that the politics are hard. So bearing all that in mind, what do I think about the filibuster itself? Well, I worked in the Senate for 6 years. I was in the minority for most of that time, and so of course I developed a healthy respect for the filibuster. When you're in the minority in the Senate, it is what stands between you and the downfall of the Republic. On a different note, though, I think we often think about the filibuster as being a source of power for the minority. I think more accurately, I would characterize it as a source of power for individual members. The right to unlimited debate and unlimited amendment are the foundation of senators' power, not just those in the minority, but every senator. That is the reason why I think Senator McConnell, when asked whether he was interested in abolishing the filibuster for general legislation, said he doesn't have the votes. And that's simply because senators can exercise that power in a variety of ways. It's not just minority versus minority. There are issues that divide the Senate along regional lines, such as transportation bills, or economic lines, such as farm bills versus the needs of those who represent urban states. And so I think if we step back and look at the politics of filibuster reform, that's one of the reasons why it's so challenging. It's because this is a source of individual power, not simply power for the minority. Now, all that said, I've made some arguments about some places where adjusting the filibuster may help. And the distinction I want to draw is this. Oftentimes we talk about the filibuster as protecting the right to debate or protecting the minority. I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is that it prevents, or rather allows a minority to preserve the status quo. Now, in normal policy areas, so you're trying to prevent a change to the law, that may be well and good. But That's not the case in all areas, and I think about appropriations bills, for example. Appropriations bills expire after a year. If they are allowed to expire, the government shuts down, or Congress has to come up with a backstop measure, such as passing a CR. So I draw a distinction between those areas where inaction leads to no change in the law versus where inaction may actually have significant consequences, as it does on appropriations bills. Now, my recent book on the Senate studies the appropriations process, and one of the conclusions I draw is that Senate leaders are reluctant to bring appropriations bills to the floor because they know they will face potential filibusters and difficult votes on amendments. The result is that they simply don't bring those bills to the floor at all. Instead, they write an omnibus bill behind closed doors. In other words, the right to unlimited debate in the Senate actually leads to less debate in the Senate because leaders are unwilling to bring those bills to the floor because they're afraid they will lose control of debate. So I've argued in the past that it may make sense on some categories of legislation, such as appropriations bills, to lower the threshold for proceeding to debate and ending debate to a simple majority. Now, I wouldn't extend that to other categories of legislation where current law would remain in place. Now, there are some problems with what I've just suggested, which is that if appropriations bills could proceed on a majority vote, they would become the logical train leaving the station for all kinds of other legislation. And so I think germaneness requirements would have to be really tightly strengthened to prevent that sort of thing from happening. I also think there is a consequence that we often don't talk about to bringing bills to the floor and just opening up debate on them. And that is the majority party has to be willing to release some control. If you do that, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. You're going to open the door to the minority winning some victories. And I think one of the reasons the majority party avoids the floor is because they're trying to retain tight control over the policymaking process. That's why I always take calls for regular order with sort of a grain of salt. It's actually a call to redistribute power in a way that hurts the interests of the majority party. And I think oftentimes we avoid that fact, that sort of hard fact about it, in simply calling for more open debate. So I think we have to recognize that that would be one consequence. Now there's a final criticism which I'll just address here before turning things over to James, and that's the worry that if you did abolish the filibuster on appropriations legislation, that you'd see more examples of the majority just jamming the minorities. So for example, they could end debate, push through a more highly partisan policy than they might be able to otherwise. Here I agree with Cy that there are a lot of protections in our constitutional system against that. Power in government is not normally unified. More often than not, it's divided between the parties. So between bicameralism and the separation of powers between Congress and the president, it's actually quite difficult for the majority in one party to simply steamroll the other. So I'll leave things there and turn things over to James. Thank you.
Thank you, and let me say thank you to Gary and to AEI for hosting this wonderful event, and it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to appear with such a great and learned panelist. Also, I wanted to echo the comments about the terrific edited volume, Is Congress Broken? It was a great volume. I recommend it for anyone who hasn't yet read it. I also want to say before I start beating up on the Senate too much that I love it dearly. It's a fabulous, fabulous institution. I wept like a baby on my last day in the Senate. I didn't even see it coming, and I just got overcome with emotion. It was so embarrassing, and I don't know why I'm telling you that right now. But I do love it. But it's got some problems, and just look at it today, right? There's a lot of problems. It's not doing anything. We were joking earlier that they could rent out the chamber on Airbnb, make some money. We could have Model UN there, right? We could do other things with that space. I don't know. They're literally doing nothing on the floor. Well, why is that a problem? Well, if you're a Republican or if you're a conservative, you're upset because they're not repealing Obamacare. They're not passing tax reform yet. They're not doing all these great things that you've been waiting out in the wilderness for so long for them to do. Right? If you're an institutionalist, it's not acting like the institution ought to act, right? It's just not working. And so the question becomes, what should we do about it? But before we get into what we should do about it, I think it's important to take a step back and say, well, what's really the problem, right? Because the conventional view says that it's the filibuster, it's minority obstruction, That's just a fancy way of saying we don't like conflict. We've got too much conflict in the Senate. And so therefore we have to get rid of it. And you can get rid of it by getting new members who are less polarized, right? And then they'll all come back to the Senate and they'll all negotiate and we'll have common sense agreements that everybody agrees on and everything's going to be wonderful. That's one way. It's really hard to do, right? You got to wait for elections. You got to win elections. And you've got this pesky little thing called the American voter who usually gets in the way of that. So barring that, what do? You don't say, well, conflict's now good. No, it's still bad, so how do you get rid of it? Well, you try to figure out a way to write the rules to minimize or eliminate that conflict, to get around that conflict. And that's where the filibuster comes in. Because again, the problem is too much conflict, according to the conventional view. And the reason why you have too much conflict is because the minority party can obstruct. And the majority party doesn't like that. I don't think this is accurate, right? I don't think we have too much conflict. I don't think we have enough conflict in the Senate today. In fact, if you look at what's happening in the Senate, I would submit to you that there's no real conflict occurring on the Senate floor. But before we get there, what are the consequences of viewing conflict as a bad thing in our politics? Because these are really important things here. The consequence is that you try to get around it, you minimize it, you develop these ad hoc processes to overcome it. Because regular order, whatever that means, certainly involves some sort of committee markups, some sort of floor debates, some sort of voting and amendments, those types of things. Well, those things help exacerbate and fuel conflict, right? Disagreement. And so therefore you figure out how to get around that. So you begin to write bills outside of committees. You begin to centralize power in certain places. You begin to construct a process to basically prevent amendment votes and to prevent debate. And the expectation becomes we can't have any of that stuff because the conflict that's just lurking right around the corner waiting to destroy and devour us all is going to be too much, and this is too important to get through. So you develop these processes. Well, what happens when you do that? Well, there are very serious consequences. One, it doesn't work. Case in point, what's happening today, right? Number two, you begin to undermine trust in our institutions, right? When everything is developed via an ad hoc process, you have no idea what's happening. You don't know who the pivotal players are. And by you, I mean the American voter. I mean someone in a think tank trying to understand what's going on, a journalist, or even a senator. You don't know where the important decisions are being made. And because of that, you don't know who the pivotal players are. You can't hold people responsible for outcomes. And therefore, the outcomes typically are somewhat wildly different than the expectation that you were led to believe that was going to result. And so what happens? You get cynical and frustrated and apathetic. And all of the things that we see both in the Senate, in this town, and around this country today is all being fueled by the way the Senate is dealing with its problems. And it's all being fueled by this view of conflict as a negative thing, right? Well, conflict is a good thing. That's literally how our system works. That's what the framers thought. That's what separation of powers is about. That's what federalism is about. That's what bicameralism is about, and that's what democracy is about. And we have very important and divisive issues before us right now. But we can't deal with them if we're trying to minimize conflict and we're trying to minimize debates and protect ourselves from voting on amendments, right? You're not going to be able to do that. And so how do you solve that problem? Well, I submit that you follow the legislative process, that you have conflict, that you basically empower both sides to force their view into the conversation. Because if you eliminate the filibuster, what you're doing is you're reducing the minority's leverage. You're reducing their leverage, and you're basically entrusting to the good graces of the majority the ability to say and to be able to recognize, well, you know, this is an important amendment that you have, right? And we know that you really want to do this, and this is a good-natured thing, so therefore we're going to allow you to offer this amendment. Well, it doesn't work like that. When you're in the majority, every amendment is a poison pill amendment. When you're in the majority, every minute of debate time is too much, is a filibuster. And so you're never going to be able to have genuine conflict and deliberation without having some sort of power with the minority. So the filibuster, to the extent that it helps do that, is a good thing. It helps to force that conflict, right? And this is really key because the legislative process, it reveals information about all of the different sides in the debate, right? And last time I checked, a handful of people can't go into a room somewhere and rewrite the healthcare system. It's not going to work out. I don't care if you're a conservative or a liberal or a Republican or a Democrat. That's not the way the human brain works. You have to bring different interests to bear. This is Madison. This is Federalist 10. How do you prevent tyranny? You create a system, in 51 too, you create a system where the only majority that can prevail is one dedicated to justice and the general good. That's how you do it. And the way you do that is by having a lot of interests come together, clash, and debate. And sometimes you're not going to agree. And you know what happens then? The people get to weigh in. And they get to decide. And they vote. And they demonstrate. And then the people in power say, oh, well, maybe we should do this now. And that's how the system ought to work. And it's not clean. It's not pretty. But it's worked. And it's worked for a very long time. And the majority has plenty of tools at their disposal to do these, to keep conflict and too much obstruction in check. But you have to go back to looking at conflict and looking at the process as a good thing. And you begin to be able to resolve the most intractable issues before us. Even if you don't have the ability to prevail 100% guaranteed all the time. Well, why is that? One thing is that there's rules on the books that empower the majority to make things hard for the minority. And then this is even more simple than that. It's about the politics of effort. I see a former parliamentarian, Alan Fruman, in the audience, and when I was in the Senate, I would go down, and my colleagues at the steering committee would go down all the time and give them such a hard time, and we would come up with these convoluted ideas, and it was brilliant on paper, right? I mean, there were some of the most brilliant things, I'm sure he would say so, out there, I think, right? It's just, it was like notebooks full of these elaborate theories, and we would go down, and then inevitably something would be wrong, or you would have to inject human beings into it. Obstruction is hard. It really is. Put yourself in a senator's shoes. Tell them to go down to the floor and say, hey, we're going to stop this thing. We don't have the votes to prevail on a vote, but we're going to stop it, and the way we're going to do it is you're going to talk for 20 hours. And then your buddy's going to come down, and he's going to ask you some questions. We're going to try to go 6 hours longer. Or we're going to filibuster by amendment, and we're going to force roll call votes forever, right? Forever. Even though you know they've lost. That's a hard thing. And in my experience, the senators never go for it. They just don't like doing that kind of stuff. And we were saying before, once you realize that the other side has the votes, and once you've had your say and you've lost, all of the energy, all of the passion, it disappears. It evaporates overnight. And something that you were fighting tooth and nail, let's just voice vote it, let's get out of here, I want to go home. But that's human nature. That's the politics of effort. And that's how you solve the problem. You don't solve it by taking away the minority's power. Because if you do that, you're only going to get more of what we have now. The majority is going to retreat further into their party lunches. They're going to try even harder to come up with elaborate legislative deals that they have to protect at all costs. They're going to further limit the minority. And yes, bicameralism I think is still a good thing, but it doesn't solve the problem because right now we have parties, regardless of if Democrats or Republicans in control, that view bicameralism as just a hindrance, that we should somehow cooperate with each other when we're all in control, that we should defer to the president on nominations and on legislation because the president is a Republican and Republicans control Congress. That's not how the place was meant to work. And while the filibuster was certainly not in the original design that was agreed to in in Philadelphia, it still is consistent to the extent that it thwarts the ability of a majority to impose its will, a la the House in the Senate, and then to cooperate with the co-partisan majority in the House and to defer to the president. And if we have that, and that's what's happening, and that's what I believe will, if we get rid of things like the filibuster, and we begin to alter our mind about how the Senate ought to work, that's what we're going to end up with. And that is what the framers defined as tyranny. This is important. Tyranny is not some evil monster somewhere who does a lot of really bad things. Tyranny is when the same set of hands, whether one, a few, or many, make all the decisions and hold all the power. And if parties are as polarized as everybody says they are, I have my doubts, but if they are, and those parties are in control of the Senate and of the House and of the executive and the president, and the Senate has decided to yield all of its ability to pick and choose who the noms are on the judicial bench, and so now they're also in the Supreme Court, right? Then guess what? You begin to have the same kind of view, the same kind of outlook that pervades everything. And yes, I think in that environment, it is important to make sure that individual senators, regardless of who they are, regardless of what party they're in, and regardless of what they believe, to have an ability to stand up and say no, because that's what our system is all about. Thank you.
Thanks. You know, you were talking about tearing up. You know, we love the Senate. It reminded me that when I worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee and then was a staff director, you know, we'd often pass our bill in the middle of the night because nobody cared until there was a crisis, and then they all cared. But so it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning when you'd be down there, and there'd be hardly anybody on the Senate floor and the like, and you'd do your business and you'd walk out. And even though I subsequently worked in the White House, there is really nothing quite like the night when the Capitol's lit up and all white, and it's just it's a special view. So with that sort of remark. So let me, I mean, I have lots of questions, and I don't want to foreclose everybody commenting on the other panelists' presentations, but one sort of striking thing was, just to sort of begin this, James, you seem to argue that ending the filibuster would end or lessen debate, lessen the chances for debate. I think I heard Peter say that the filibuster actually, as it is, lessens debate. So I guess the sort of factual question is, did I hear that correctly? Or is there some way to reconcile the two views, or are you guys just in disagreement?
I tend to think we agree. My point is that the responsibility is really on the majority, and the majority gives the minority a veto. The majority right now allows the filibuster to be used as a veto. We don't have any filibusters last time I checked right now. Most filibusters are just the cloture vote that fails and they move on. And so I think my point is, if you get rid of the filibuster, then when you do want to actually have a debate, the minority is going to have less tools at its disposal to force that debate. But I think I certainly agree now where the filibuster, it's not used in any way, it's just a veto.
Just a couple of thoughts here. I mean, one is, certainly in the appropriations process, I think there's a lot of evidence that the majority party fears filibusters on the floor. It fears poison pill amendments on the floor, and that's one of the reasons it avoids the floor. Mm-hmm. And so it simply doesn't bring bills to the floor. Senators don't get an opportunity to debate them. That means they write them behind closed doors. Now, I think we generally sort of assume that's a bad thing. I mean, I actually think I'm a political scientist. I don't know that we have the evidence to actually say that. It could be that there's good deliberation happening behind closed doors on those bills, and we're just not able to see it. But at least it's moving off the floor and behind closed doors. So I see the existence of the filibuster in the appropriations process is actually moving debate off the floor when it could be out in the open. I do think there's a second interesting point, though, and this gets to the question of what would happen if the Senate had a majority rules system on appropriations bills, at least as I argue. And I think one way you can find the answer is just to look to what's been going on in the House. And until very recently, the House, which is probably more polarized than the Senate and has much stronger rules of majority control, until the last few years, they debated appropriations bills under an open rule. And you can see the patterns really clearly. The minority offered a lot of amendments. They won a lot of those fights, and those bills came off the floor heavily shaped by the majority and the minority. And I think the reason the majority allowed that, even in highly polarized times, is because appropriators operated off the theory that their bills had to be passed, and the way they ensured a coalition of support is that they allowed everybody to participate. Now, the danger that creates is you allow the minority to work mischief, and maybe the minority plays ball and maybe it doesn't, or maybe your own members don't want to play ball and they want to offer amendments that are opportunities for grandstanding and scoring political points. But at least until very recently, the House majority of both parties allowed that kind of open debate to take place, and it generally worked. Now, in the last few years, it hasn't worked as well. So I can think of an example where Paul Ryan brought an appropriations bill to the floor. Democrats offered an amendment on LGBT rights that ended up derailing the bill. And, so open debate can also lead to legislating that derails legislation. So leave things there.
Zach, did you want to jump in on anything?
Well, are we at the stage of commenting on each other's?
Yeah,
points?
please.
So I think people that want to get rid of the filibuster aren't afraid of conflict. I think, to go back to what Peter said earlier, no one thinks that there's a dearth of conflict in the House. I think there's plenty of conflict in the House, right? The question is, like, when are you going to get to the actual question at hand and either stop having a debate, which, we don't have the filibuster, but that was sort of the idea, or, when you're going to move to actually vote on a bill where you don't require 60 senators. And I think the point I was trying to make is we have a number of checks in our system that are designed to prevent majority tyranny, and it's the separation of powers that does that, right? It's the division of Congress into two chambers. And so I don't think it's true that if the Senate got rid of the filibuster, we'd have tyranny in this country. And there are other countries that are just parliamentary systems that aren't tyrannical, right? I mean, I don't think England is tyrannical. They don't have they have a bicameral system with a weak House of Lords, but they don't have a separate executive. So what I understand, and my understanding for why senators keep the filibuster is they think it gives them more power when they're in the minority. And I understand that from their own particular perspective. I think they have to also realize it gives them less power when they're in the majority, and they're willing to make that trade, and that's fine. But I don't know if that's a good trade for the rest of us. That's the only point that I'm making. I think, Peter has got to be right that they're not willing to make this change. They haven't done it so far. They made two changes, right? One in 2013 and one more recently with respect to Supreme Court justices. Whether they'll make the final changes is up to them.
Yeah, James, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think as far as the House goes, I think it's important to keep in mind that bicameralism wasn't just about a separate chamber. It was a chamber that was different, right? And Randolph talks in the Federal Convention about a good Senate. Like, what does he mean by a good Senate? They're very clear. They want a Senate that operates differently, that orders its deliberations by a different set of principles than the House, right? Because you can't have a check on another body if that body operates and is motivated by the same passions and runs itself by the same set of rules and institutions that the other body does. You're going to get the same outcomes. And they thought that was a bad thing. So I think that's the first point. As far as conflict goes, look, you have a big bill, you write it behind closed doors, you don't expose these deep-seated debates amongst your own members, much less the other side and your side. You put it on the floor, you fill the tree, you block all amendments, you file cloture on the first day, and then you attack as illegitimate anybody who wants to oppose it. So that's not conflict. That's not the kind of good conflict we need. What I'm talking about is if you had a more aggressive and open and robust debate over health care, we would know more about the Republican Party and where they stand on health care. And you would get outcomes a lot quicker. Nothing produces an outcome like a vote, right? And if you don't like it, okay, you may lose. But then the people can weigh in, and you can go, and you can demonstrate, you can run new candidates, you can try to get rid of them, and at the end of the day, you come back and you win. But that's how our system works. We have gotten lazy. We are saying we want to win now. We don't want to have anybody oppose us, and we want it to last in perpetuity. Well, that doesn't work.
Let me push back a little bit because if you read the Federalist Papers, which everybody should, the Senate is distinct as a body because of who elects it, the length of its terms, and the fact that it's staggered. They didn't spend much time talking about the internal rules of the Senate. So I just wonder whether, now one could argue that, look, the 17th Amendment sort of turned the body into much more of a populist body, and so therefore, it acts more like the House than what anybody intended. But it still has these other features, which is, tenure, staggered, election system, and certainly its composition in terms of majority. It has a certain kind of national majority within its body that's distinct from the kind of majority that's in the House or that elects the president. So, if I was John Jay or Hamilton, I might say, isn't that sufficient? I mean, why do we expect the Senate to have these special rules that seem to frustrate, passing measures when a majority wants it?
Absolutely, and it's a great question, great point. My point is not that they would support the filibuster. I have no idea. My guess is a lot of them wouldn't. And my point is not to suggest that somehow that the filibuster is absolutely in line with what they're thinking. My point is only that it's consistent with what they were thinking. Because if you look at the way that the Senate unfolded, and the notes on the Federal Convention tell you much more than the Federalist does, but if you look at the way it unfolded, bicameralism was key, and the reasons why bicameralism was key, and then everything fell into that. State selection actually was literally the last mode of selection that would solve the problem. You couldn't have the House select them. They would be dependent on the House. They can't be a check. They're not going to let the president select them. They didn't want a popular vote because then it would operate just like the House. It was also operated via popular vote. So my point is the key thing about the Senate, the thing that you need to understand the Senate more than anything else, is its ability to check the House. That's what the framers wanted. 6-year terms help, staggered elections help, right? The rotation, all of that stuff helps. They're less valuable today than they were, but they still certainly help. But my point is that, and they even say there's a line in Federalist, I forget if it's in the 48 or 49 or 58, but basically that you have to have a different set of procedures, or they have to be ordered, I think Madison's term is by a different set of principles. And if you eliminate the filibuster in this day and age and you empower the majority, you're going to get the same order that you have in the House. It'll manifest itself in different ways, but the idea is that it's a cartel. You have a majority party, they won elections, they came in, they have strong leaders, they're going to agree on something behind closed doors, put it on the floor, rubber stamp it, and send it to the president. That's the default. And if you want to stop it, you have to spend all your time trying to disrupt it. And then if you disrupt it, then you force them to deal with you. But that's a really bad way of doing business. It generates gridlock. If you have to blow everything up to get the other side to agree with you first and to give you a vote on an amendment, then you're going to get gridlock and dysfunction.
Well, let's turn to questions from the audience. And if you would identify yourself and before you ask the question, and please wait for the mic. So in the back here, please.
Hi, my name's Aidan Myler, European Central Bank, but this is my own personal, probably naive question. I mean, one thing for me is sort of the non-linearity in democracy. I mean, why does 50% plus one get to decide 100% of all outcomes? And, particularly in a situation where, for example, I think in the US Senate, you have approximately 40% of the population represented by about 10 senators. In the United Kingdom, you've only had one government since the Second World War that had actually more than 50% of the votes. So, I mean, I have two questions. First of all, would you agree that the filibuster helps ensure some degree of bipartisanship and avoid swings too much from one side to the other as you go over this 50% threshold? And second, I mean, do you think the problem is the Senate procedures or the current political culture?
You're absolutely right that the Senate, even absent the filibuster, is a non-majoritarian institution because of the fact that smaller states receive the same representation as larger states. I also think it is the case that the filibuster forces the majority to accommodate not just with the minority, but with individual senators. And the position I've taken is that I'm content leaving that in place with carving out an exception for things we have to do every year, such as appropriations bills that are key to funding the government. We can let some things simmer. We can't let other things simmer. Some things have to get done. That's why I've drawn that line the way I have. Let me stop there and see what my colleagues have to say.
I don't think anyone is saying that the majority should be able to get its way every time it wants to. Our system isn't set up that way. I mean, the point I was trying to make is we have multiple institutions, right? Even if you had majoritarian rule in the Senate, that wouldn't guarantee the passage of anything because it has to go through the House, has to be presented to the president, and then afterwards it's mitigated in various ways by the bureaucracy and the courts. So this is a system of multiple checks. And I think an interesting thought experiment would be, well, what if we had this rule for the House? Right. Well, what if we just, I think if we just moved the filibuster to the House, would we have a better system? Would the system be what we have today? And I don't really know, what the argument would be for wanting to have the filibuster in the House. But it just seems to me that if you believe in the filibuster, why can't four justices prevent, the justices from reaching a decision? Why can't, 5 cabinet members have a filibuster within the cabinet meeting and prevent the president from issuing a regulation? You can take this principle and apply it in other institutions in our government and then ask the question, would this be a good way of functioning? And I understand that the system is designed to stop tyranny. I think it does that without regard to whether there's a filibuster.
I think, just real quick, I think the difference with the House is 435 members. You can't let them talk for a long time or you can't ever get anything done, right? That's the point. I think the Senate's smaller, and the framers wanted it to be smaller so that it would operate differently. And so the filibuster makes no sense in the House for that very reason. The House is geared and biased towards decision-making because that's in its institutional DNA, whereas deliberation is baked into the Senate's institutional DNA. Now, the House can certainly deliberate if it wants to. The other thing I would add is the majority has lots of power to do stuff. They're just not doing it. They're basically going to the minority and saying, hey, will you vote for this? Will you give us unanimous consent to vote on this? And they say no. And they go, oh, we can't do it. And they walk away. Well, I would say no, too. I'm going to see how far I can get, what I can get away with. And then they'll push back. In the old days, they'd push back. Really? Well, this is what we're going to do. And you would lose support real quick on your side, either because most people supported it, or they didn't want to stick around until 4 in the morning on a Thursday night, right? Because you want to go home and see your family, or you're just tired because you've been working all day. Nobody wants to stick around like that. And if the majority sends a very clear signal that we care about this, and we're going to try to push it through based on the rules that we have under the existing Senate rules, the minority can stand up and say no, and they'll fight back. This is a war of attrition. This is how the Senate worked and did really tough things for a very long, long time. And it worked, and it helped reveal information about how much they cared about things. But you have to try. What the majorities want to do today is get the outcomes they want without trying. And that leads, I think, to sloppy outcomes that are unstable, that are always going to be perpetually challenged. And I also don't think it's helpful. I mean, it's not going to succeed. I mean, look at what's happening to the Republicans in the Senate right now. Repealing Obamacare was a 7-year promise, unambiguous. They can't do it because they're divided. They don't agree on it. And so getting rid of the filibuster, I think, exacerbates all of the bad things that we see in the Senate today without actually solving any of the problems that people that want to kind of neutralize this conflict and allow us to do things. I don't think it's going to allow us to do things. It's going to push things further away.
Right here, and then right there.
My name's Alan Aaron-Hawk. I find myself reading all the time these days about the time-honored historic Senate practice of requiring 60 votes. And I'm old enough to remember that before about 1990, virtually nothing required 60 votes, unless it involved civil rights or race in some respect. So part of the problem, it seems to me, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that elite opinion is misinformed about the filibuster and its historic role in the Senate. And one step forward would be to straighten this out and make it clear that until Bob Dole said in the early 1990s, Bill Clinton isn't going to get anything without 60 votes, until then, there was no time-honored tradition of 60 votes. Or am I mistaken?
It's a wonderful book on the filibuster by Sarah Binder and Steve Smith, in which they take on some of the rhetoric about the filibuster. And one of the points they make in that book is that filibustering even small things, not just the most significant bills of the day, has been a common practice in the Senate at different points in its history. And we can look back to the mid-20th century and perhaps see it used more sparingly, but if you back up to the 19th century, you see it used more in a fashion as it was today. So I think that just the answer varies with the point in time we're looking at.
Alan Fruman, Parliamentarian Emeritus of the Senate. My view of the filibuster is informed not by academic studies, but by a career spent working at the Senate. When I left the House payroll in 1977, my attitude on the filibuster was closer to size, and I gravitated toward James's attitude after about a week or two. The Senate really is a fascinating place. The Senate, I tell people, it's an acquired taste, like blue cheese dressing or scotch. You need to give it time.
Keep going.
I like both of those. Are we going to have those after this?
It's worth developing the taste. It doesn't take long working at the Senate to appreciate that when you talk about the filibuster, you're talking about the culture of the institution. And you're talking about the manner in which the individuals in that institution interact with each other. And it's a remarkable phenomenon to work with people who in other institutions would be powerless. And I'm looking at James and people that have worked with him, and I will salute the industry and the effort that you brought to bear. You won some, you lost some, you were an enormous pain in the ass, but your industry, your integrity was never in question. And this is something that you were able to do as a minority staffer, and for your senator as a minority senator, which you would never have had a prayer of doing in a majoritarian institution. So I come at this from a personal standpoint, but I want to comment on a couple of things you said. And as I said, Cy, I agreed with you at the outset. After a week or so, most of my comments will be directed either to James or Peter. You mentioned that constitutionally the Senate was designed to check the House. More so, I believe the Senate was designed to check the President. If you look at the Constitution, the references to the Senate in Article 1 are pretty scarce. It's in Article 2, when the Constitution talks about the Senate, the advice and consent of the Senate in the nomination process, and the advice and consent of the Senate to the ratification of treaties. And I think it's critically important that we remember the Senate's role as a check against the President, number one. Number two, well, moving aside from that, and I don't disagree with anything you said, James. Peter, you suggested with respect to appropriation bills that perhaps there should be an exception to the filibuster. And when you say that, in essence, you're talking about another reconciliation process. You're talking about declaring a class of bills in the Senate too important to be subject to the filibuster. And if the Senate decides to go down that road, I simply suggest that you triple the salary of the parliamentarian. Because if you've watched what she's going through with reconciliation, right, when you have a fast track and you say the filibuster is out, the traditional protection the Senate gives its minority is out. The only protection to the minority are the procedures and the person giving advice with respect to those procedures. I think institutionally it would make sense to treat appropriation acts as privileged such that they can't be filibustered. But once you do that, you have to have strict rules, as you said, prohibiting non-germane amendments, prohibiting amendments that are, again, authorization on appropriations, and you need to protect those, you need to give teeth to those restrictions with a 60-vote point of order or 60-vote waiver, and you need to protect the parliamentarian, who's the person who's making those decisions. So I want to thank all of you for bringing all this up. Again, I believe that the filibuster makes no sense. I think it's difficult to defend it in theory, but I certainly lived it in practice, and I think in practice, when you get down to the granular, individual situations as to who's involved in this process, who is being empowered in this process, what they are bringing to bear in this process, I think it's extremely important. I will also say that the filibuster is a tool that should be used sparingly and with respect, and with restraint. And the problem that I believe we've had in the last decade or so is that there's been no restraint on the part of successive minorities in utilizing what is not a power, but a privilege that the majority has granted to the minorities over the years. So I think as an institution it's sound, but you need a critical mass of responsible adults as opposed to a critical mass of petulant infants who always want their way to make the Senate function the way it had functioned since 1806 when the filibuster became possible. Thank you.
One more. We have time for actually one more question, and he had his hand up first, so I'll cross here.
Thank you. I'm Rick Beth, until recently with the Congressional Research Service. First of all, James Wallner brought up the point about it being hard to pursue things because everybody wants to go home. I think that could be given more emphasis, that one of the reasons the filibuster threat has become more intense is that time pressures are greater, and it's not, I think, so much for workload reasons as it is for reasons of scarcity of floor time because nobody wants to be there.
So how about, instead of getting into the filibuster, let's just show up to work before noon on a Monday. Let's just try that for like a month, and then let's see where we go from there, right?
I seem to remember...
I'm really worried that my boss's AI are going to hear that, no, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, but everybody wants to go home for good reasons. I don't think you can get them to come. Didn't Howard Baker try that? Second, however, I just wanted to say, parenthetically, there's one sense in which the supermajority requirement in the Senate operates in a pro-majoritarian way because a block of senators from the large states can block things without being a majority in the Senate. But more importantly, I wanted to say, it seems to me the fundamental dilemma is if the minority has an absolute possibility of blocking things, then they have an incentive for intransigence. They have an incentive for carrying on a filibuster. On the other hand, if you allow a majority to close debate, then the majority has an incentive for intransigence and for not listening to anybody else. How do you find the proper balance between those two things, between freedom of debate and certainty of decision, as Walter Kravitz used to say at CRS? And so, to quote yet another colleague, Stan Bach, recently, a former colleague of mine, recently died. If you want to say that the minority has to be guaranteed a possibility of saying things, you've got a strong case for that. But if you want to say they have an absolute ability to block things from coming to a vote at all, that's a much steeper climb. How do you balance the majority, against the possibility of majority intransigence and the possibility of minority intransigence?
It's a fantastic effort. I'll just say real quick. This is what I mean, fantastic question. This is what I refer to as the politics of effort. And this helps get at the responsible adult theory as well. You basically, if both sides have leverage, but the majority's got a little bit more, and you have to show up, and you actually have to put in effort, right? You have to hold the floor. You have to have votes. You have to do things that are painful. Then that's how you police yourself. And that's how the Senate policed itself for a very long time and did a lot of very, very controversial things. We were saying before, the golden age of the Senate, before the Civil War, late 19th century when it was running the government, and then the 60s and 70s. It's no coincidence those are the times where the conflict was at its highest. The stuff we have now pales in comparison to the issues and the conflict that they had at those times. But we say these are the August times that we need to get back to that are wonderful, right? But the difference was you had to put in effort if you wanted to stop something. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And yes, you're going to keep going forward. But if you allow the minority to veto things without trying, then of course they're going to veto things. That right now what the Democrats are doing on judges, I would have done it at the steering committee. You block everything, right? And you hope you get away with it. But you can't bluff too much. Because if you do, they're never going to take your threat seriously in the future. So you have to figure it out, and it's constantly, you're dealing with each other in this uncertain environment, and it's all a bluff, but you're trying to figure out, if I push the envelope, can I win? Because you don't want to push the envelope and lose, because that makes it harder to bluff the next time. But that's a process. That's how international relations operates, right? We somehow managed to get through the Cold War without having a nuclear war, but yet the Senate can't operate like this? Like, this is the way it works. But we've somehow forgotten that. But we got to get back to the politics of effort.
So we're basically out of time, but I wanted to give Peter and Cy chances to say anything final that they want to before we close. So
Sure, thanks, Gary. I guess my final point is just that we need to remember members act to advance their own interests. I mean, that's a fundamental tenet of the study of Congress as political scientists. That makes pursuing these kinds of reforms, frankly, hard because, as I said, the filibuster is not the seat of minority power in the Senate, it's the seat of individual power. And you have to ask why individual members would want to give that up. I think they have under a narrow set of circumstances. I take Mitch McConnell at his word that they're not willing to give it up for general legislation yet. That also makes simply bringing things to the floor for debate, as James has been talking about, complicated, right? Because they're going to pursue their interests in ways that are going to make life difficult for the majority. They're going to offer poison pill amendments that are going to be hard for majority members to vote on. They're going to try and stop things in their tracks. And so my proposal of focusing on appropriations bills, I selected that in part because those are some of the most bipartisan things we have, right? Despite the conflict we have over them, most folks agree we need to pass the budget. And so if we can find those areas where members want to get stuff done, open up debate in those areas, I think it can be fruitful. But I think we have to be aware of the fact that members are going to pursue their interests, and they're not always going to want to do it in the ways that are going to enhance deliberation on the floor.
I'll just add that I very much enjoyed Peter's paper on the appropriations process and the reforms he suggested. But I'll also add that he talks about appropriations as must-pass bills and other bills as it's okay if we don't have action. And the way I perceive it is, no action is not the status quo, because other things happen in Washington when Congress doesn't act, right? I compare the agencies and the president and the courts to kids. And if the two parents aren't able to get their act together, the kids just do whatever they want. And that's what happened, right? When Obama had his We Can't Wait program in 2011, he blamed a do-nothing Congress. And I think you're going to see more of that in this administration. They're going to start being more aggressive with their initiatives if they don't perceive them they don't perceive Congress as doing anything. Not merely not doing what they want, but not doing anything. And I'll end there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the discussion is clearly, I mean, I began with the introductory remarks talking about just how complicated the Senate business is in particular. I mean, it's got to be representative, it's got to deliberate, it's got to do oversight, it's got to, pass bills for money and the like. But I would also say we've had this comment where somebody said, the Senate's task is to check the House, and then you mentioned that it's also to check the president. But I would also say it's got a job of actually passing legislation, because it is a legislative body. So again, there's no easy answer for these things. Again, it's a complex task that the Senate has in front of it, and the filibuster obviously is part and parcel of trying to figure out how to balance those various tasks. So I'm not sure we solved the issue of the filibuster, but I think if you'll join me in thanking the panelists, I think we've done a very good job of laying out the parameters of the issue itself. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.